All right. Hello, everybody that's tuned in, called in, logged in. This is week 3 of History of Photography with me, ImaniHadden. I'll be covering the Civil War, the Gilded and Victorian ages, and the rise of industrialization from 1861 to the early 1900s. My contact information. My Instagram is ImaniHadden, my first name and my last name. My email, ImaniHaddenPhotography@gmail.com. I'm available for career building and mentorship for high schoolers in the AV. So that's Lancaster and Palmdale regions. I'm the photographer for Peace in the Streets, and I'm handling their arts portion of the STEM, so science, technology, engineering, arts, mathematics. My background, I hold a Bachelor's of Fine Arts in Photography from Tulane University. I also hold a double minor in art history and architecture. Professionally, I am a personal and public event photographer, a real estate photographer, and I consider myself a visual artist. General Zoom meetup and housekeeping rules. Please stay muted with your screens turned off. Questions will be at the end. There'll be no homework, no note taking required, no testing. Okay, so I'm going to do a week 1 and week 2 recap for those of you that are just joining or that are new. In week 1, I talked about the prehistory, Paleolithic era drawing and painting, how light was used as an external source to create. So prehistoric peoples used lighting sources in order to draw and to paint on the caves that are seen in various parts of Europe. In the ancient Greco-Roman times, light was used to show surfaces elevation and the differences in surface elevation. In the Middle Ages, light was used as a way to show depth and volume on 2D and 3D surfaces. In the Renaissance era, drawing, sculptures, and paintings were shown with depth using light. So a continuation of the medieval times before. In the Baroque era, light portrayed juxtaposing dark and light pigments in paintings in the tops of churches and combined with 3D elements with crown molding in order to show the differences in elevation. Light was used to create the art in the coming eras, and this was a major shift. So Schultz was creating pigmented pieces of art, or what would be art artifacts using silver nitrates and other compounds. Daguerre and the daguerreotype were the first photographic artifacts to ever exist that were long-term. So others were made before, but they faded. Talbot and the calotype. Talbot's calotypes were the first film-like paper substrate to record imagery. In week 1, we're taking a step back. Did photography really make painting obsolete? We also talked about, can we trust painting that depicts reality? And both remained throughout time up until now to show history, and is used for different reasons. Week 2 recap, we talked about albumin prints, and these prints used egg white in order to develop the glass negatives. Photography was used to document colonial travels and stereotype non-European peoples. So I covered Asia as well as the African continent broadly. In week 2, we also talked about painting and photography share the same cultural subject, which is the American Indian peoples. George Catlin painted from 1830 to 1855, and Aaron Huey portrayed Pine Ridge Reservation from 2006 to 2013. So we're going forward to week 3, the battlefield and the parlor. The Civil War era was the first major conflict to be thoroughly photographed in its entirety, and the images were widely displayed and sold nationwide. So this is the first phenomena of a war being shown nationwide, particularly in newsprints. And there was former sterilized views of death and conflict. So many people painted what they thought war was like. And Lambden at the front shows a Union soldier who's staring down at the ground. This was the home front's ideas of what war and conflict may have been like. It's understood it was not a fun time to be in, especially if you were a soldier of any sort. Chapman, father and son duo, had the evening gun, Fort Sumter, in 1864. This painting was made off of a sketch after the battle had been completed. Notice how there are no dead bodies, not very realistic considering war has many casualties. Brarsted's guerrilla warfare, another sterilized view with painting. So painters painted what was aesthetically pleasing, what made the subjects look very heroic, very put together. There was not much blood and gore portrayed. With Gauls holding the line at all hazards, this is the Confederate side, painted in 1882. This shows a beginning of a skirmish. There are 2, maybe 3 dead bodies here. Not really realistic considering there was more casualties, more gunshot wounds, more cannon wounds. For photography, the wet plate process was taken into the battlefield, so glass negatives had to be prepped on the site. And they used various chemicals, peroxylin, alcohol, ether, zinc, bromide, and others, including fresh water, and in mixing containers used to produce these negatives in order to be portrayed properly in the battlefield. And these individuals who were making these photography pieces were greatly rewarded because it was very difficult to do on site. They had to take all their own chemicals, they had to mix them up, and also possibly risk getting shot or killed on these battlefields as well. So the harsh realities of the battlefield, Gardner and O'Sullivan showed famous generals' heroism. Although we wouldn't necessarily think that these bodies are showing heroism, back in that time, it was very much a patriotic act to serve for the war, as well as maybe today as well. Alexander Gardner showed the aftermath of Antietam in Maryland, the bodies of the dead Louisiana regiment. So these images were made after the war. The ones made during the war tended to be very blurry and fuzzy due to the photograph's inability to pick up on movement due to the shutter speed. So many people followed the regiments throughout the Civil War and took pictures after the battle had already happened. Gardner was the only photographer permitted to the execution of Lincoln's assassination conspirators. So these photographers were used by the United States government as well as other agencies to document other elements of the Civil War. This image shows a stereograph, which is 2 side-by-side images, one rendered darker and one rendered lighter. And when looked at through a stereograph, you'll be able to see the 2 images juxtaposed, now combined together. And this Battle of Antietam was considered one of the bloodiest fights with more than 25,000 casualties. Gardner also conducted his own studies. So if there was a body that he perceived to be better suited in a different position, he would move it and make an image of the deceased soldier. So Home of the Rebel Sharpshooter, made in 1863, 2 years before the Civil War had ended. He also photographed Native American delegates. So this is the Inktawan Nakota from the South Dakota and North Dakota regions, and they are in their traditional tribal outfits. It's important to note they're in their traditional tribal outfits to show that they are delegates coming from a separate region, a separate nation. So these nations had not yet assimilated. There was working progress through to the fact of the manifest destiny moving across the country at the time, that they are trying to get indigenous peoples to assimilate to the Western American cultures. The Indian Peace Commissioners in Council, this was also taken by Gardner, and it was at Fort Laramie in the Dakota Territory in 1868. You see the American delegates as well as the American Indian delegates talking, meeting, trying to make some sort of peaceful resolution to what would become the states moving across the country. And the industrialization moves westward. So this is a picture of the railroad tracks being staked across the United States. These had to be built. And these railroads also were put throughout the American South in order to move goods, cannons, sometimes men, to various parts of the regions where they needed to have them for these battles. And industrialization in the northern home front had a lot of children working. So they were hired as sorters and newspaper hands. They spindled cotton and sewed. So these children were no more than 12, as young as 4 or 5, as long as they were able to sit up and repeat these menial tasks, they were able to be hired and to work in the Industrial Revolution in the North. They worked as seamstresses as well. So this young girl is spinning the cotton and it will be made into various goods, tablecloths, clothing, jackets, pants. They were oyster shuckers. They were also working in the coal mines. Yes, children worked in the coal mines. It was a very dangerous occupation, but they were small enough to get into the low mining shafts and the small caverns. Moving to Matthew Brady, he had a lot of political and military clientele. He took the first full-length photograph of Abraham Lincoln before he was president. He also took Northern military generals, Ulysses S. Grant, Winfield Scott Hancock, and let me see, George McClellan. And these were albumin prints, silver negatives, wet collodion negatives. So the same wet collodion process that was used on the battlefield was used in the studios. Brady would invite his clients to the studio, sit and pose them, record the images, and go through the developing process. And we have these artifacts today. Brady also took pictures of George Armstrong Custer, and there was an unknown artist that created the image of Buffalo Calf Road woman, an indigenous Cheyenne First Nation woman who had actually been now known to have shot and killed Custer off of his horse. So she had joined the Battle of Wounded Knee, Little Big Horn, and also participated in the war efforts when the United States was moving westward into the Indian American frontiers. Indigenous peoples on the battlefield, so the 5 civilized tribes that were concentrated in the South, which is the Choctaw, Chickasaw, Cherokee, Seminole, and Muscogee Creek Indians, had divided loyalties towards the North and the South. So it really just depended on which fraction of the tribe wanted to go with the North, which fraction of the tribe wanted to go with the South. Apothiahala, the Creek chief, was with the North, There was also many unknown American Indian soldiers, and in the Indian Home Guard in Oklahoma, they were used as scouts in order to see how the South was trying to advance into the northern borders, or what would be the Midwest. Confederate soldiers in the southern states, they're particularly Cherokee American Indians, and they were also Seminole American Indians. And the General Brigadier Stan Watee was the highest ranking Indian in the Confederate Army. We don't usually see American Indians portrayed in aspects of the Civil War, various battles, but there was many American Indians participating in both the northern and southern frontiers when it comes to the Civil War. Africans or African Americans in the Civil War, they were also rarely portrayed. This image is a rare portrait of a Confederate officer, Sergeant Andrew Martin Chandler on the left, and his named slave, Silas Chandler, on the right. It is rare that you see both white Americans and Black Americans together in the same image. However, it is noted that he was a body servant to his master, and Black people in the war often followed the banner of their master. So individuals that were in the American North were freed. Individuals that were in the American South that were not free or not indentured servants often went to war with their masters and were their right hands. In the North, we had examples of freedmen. So we have Christian Fleetwood. He was an abolitionist from Baltimore, Maryland, and he worked to free Africans in the United States and Liberia, and he is college educated. We don't hear much about the college educated Northern African American abolitionists, but they did exist. And Black men did fight for the North as well as the South. So we're going to talk about Victorian death photography. So there will be images of death. It was a part of their culture to document their dead as a living testament or memory to a life that was often very much short due to the wars, battles, disease, and oftentimes accidents from working in industrial sites. People would get caught up in machinery and often suffer deaths. So we're going to move on. Alphonse Leblond did daguerreotypes, and this is a father looking over his child that had just passed away. The characteristics. This type of photography often uses stands to steady the bodies for long exposures. Since these persons were also deceased, it was very easy to get a clear image. As you see on the right, here is a young lady who has passed away. She is very crisp and clear because she is deceased and is not moving, or her parents or her guardians that are in the image are slightly blurred because they had moved during the camera's exposure. These images often had one parent holding a child. So on the left, you see an African-American woman holding her deceased child. The children are often made to look as if they were sleeping. This is very much different than the sort of death remembrances that we have today. But in the Victorian era, this was very much normal. Oftentimes, people didn't have images made of them until they had died. The processes, while now more widely available, were still very expensive, and people didn't use it as a way to take pictures of their everyday life, but more as keepsake memories. These images are all also of deceased peoples. The propped stands were used to prop the deceased people up, and their eyes were opened, and they were made to look as lifelike as possible. This is considered creepy or very strange to us, the 21st century. However, the Victorians used this as a way to remember their dead. It was very much sentimental to them. We have images of entire families. At times, entire families would die of diseases, typhus, yellow fever. And so it wasn't uncommon to have a casket with the mother, father, and child all deceased, and the surviving loved ones recorded image of the family in their casket. And so we're going to take a step back. How do we remember our dearly departed today? People will tattoo meaningful words and images on their body. In certain communities, they will paint their vehicles as a moving mural to their deceased. So Aaliyah and Lisa Left Eye Lopez were both female musicians in the late 90s, early 2000s. Both had unfortunately passed away, and they are memorialized in car culture through the painting of their images on vehicles. We have Emiliano Zapata, who is a Mexican freedom fighter. He is often put in paintings. And we have memorabilia t-shirts with our dearly departed spray painted onto the front. There's murals at the Chicano Park and murals in Los Angeles, which feature various elements of culture that we want to remember, as well as persons that have been deceased, killed in the line of duty, killed during their time in their life, and we work to remember them. We canonize them on film. We canonize them on walls. We canonize them like very much like how the Victorians did. Maybe in 200 to 300 years, this sort of way of remembering our ancestors, our important persons, will be considered strange or different. But it's very important to know that we still continue the same ideals and concepts, just in different ways. So here are my sources, many sources for this week's session. Very interesting, different information for this week's session. So next week, we're going to be talking about new politics and the birth of the celebrity. And this is the progressive era and the jazz era. So the early 1900s, 1910s, teens, and the 1920s. So I want to open up the floor for questions. Anybody have any questions for this session? Unmute yourself. Any questions about the content?
I would like to ask a question.
All right, go ahead.
I noticed that during the Victorian era, they opted to memorialize with photos. Would it not have been an easier way to do a painting as opposed to a photo? Because with a painting, the person is obviously still sitting still or standing still. They have no choice in the memorialization. But in the photo, it would have been a lot easier to memorialize with a painting versus a photo. Do you know what the reasoning was for using the photo to memorialize rather than a painting?
Yeah, that's a really good question. My most clear answer from my research was the paintings would have been very quickly and sloppily done, because after death, the body goes through the post-mortem process of decaying, and it would take maybe 2 to 5 months to paint a portrait. And that's not the amount of time you would have when you have a deceased body. So I can understand the quickness or the need for quickness when doing the post-mortem Victorian photography. It just had to get done quickly. It's a matter of, we have maybe a day or so, maybe two days to go shoot versus 2 months to start the painting process, and you have this decaying body that actually really needs to be buried very quickly. Yeah, so photography was used in this aspect because of its quickness. Some people use paintings, but the paintings that I've seen they look like very, very rough, sketchy watercolors. People just preferred to use photography. It was much clearer, it was quicker, it was faster. You can develop the negative and get it to the family in a much shorter time. So yeah, photography for this one.
Okay, perfect, thank you.
Any other questions? This was a very different one. Because
Yes, I have a question. Imani, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Imani?
Yes.
Okay, hopefully I don't get cut off. I'm going to try to answer real quickly because I have such bad internet reception. Will you be doing anything as you go along to cover photography, how we're using it today through selfies, through cell phone, through videos, like what we're on even right now, as well as through tablets and just the various ways, the desktop, the laptops, and so forth?
Yes, that will be when week 9, when we get to technology today. So I'm taking us through the timeline, but that will be the last, very, very, very last session we have. December 14th. That's exciting.
Yes. Oh, okay, good. Thank you. And then lastly, on that point is, thank you very much. Will you tell us what type of film we're using now, or whatever we're using to not just film, but video, however we're doing the film in these modern times? You're going to talk to us about that as well.
Yes, the digital aspects, because we've completely moved out of the loading film into the cameras or film cameras. People still do it. I still have my old film, but it's a whole different thing we're talking about now with the digital fiber optics, the various lenses, the laser aspects, and the crystal gel that's inside computers, and of course getting my voice from where I am through a computer, or my images through a computer. I've just recently sent someone a digital portfolio. Would have been unheard of in the 70s and 80s going to art school. Back then you had to actually go and make prints and then give your images out. Now we can send them through the digital world, and that's something that's unheard of. We're so used to it, but like to sit back and think about how would I explain this to someone who's never seen a computer or doesn't know what the internet is? There's some people that are out there in those cultures that don't have this. So it's very exciting to think about how we're living right now. Super exciting. Yes, I will cover it at the end. Thank you. Any other questions about the content, the timeline, Victorians, Civil War?
I actually had one more question about the war.
Yes.
The actual prompting of those during the war, to create a specific image. What was the purpose of that? What was the purpose of posing someone during an actual war, before, during, or after a war event? Or let's say you go into a battle, and after the battle is over, you then proceed to prop people in certain positions. What was that for? Do you know?
I hate to say aesthetics of like, oh, this guy died and he kind of looked a little wimpy. Let me prop him up with his gun, make it seem like he was actively shooting. He may have gotten shot way in the beginning of the battle and fell over and looked like a bag of trash, or just laying on his side. And so it's like, oh, let me make it look very heroic, very action oriented, like he died very gallantly. But it just came down to wanting the war to look a certain way. You want the North to look a certain way. The Northerners wanted the Northern troops to look a certain way. The Southerners wanted the Southern troops to look a certain way. No one wanted to make it seem as if their soldiers were just lying there, even though I showed the artillery, the men next to the cannons that got mowed down, and they were just one right after the others. Boom, 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 boom. Well, I wouldn't consider death and war aesthetically pleasing, but you wanted the soldiers to seem like, oh man, I had to say manly, like they were doing something. It's like, well, you get shot, you're gonna die, and you fall how you fall. So I think Gardner in that aspect was trying to make it seem more interesting than it was, because death is very calm, it's very still, it's very static. So we wanted to sort of impose what he thought would be a good pose for some of the bodies. Not all of them were that, but yeah, I find that very strange that Gardner did that. And he sent those pictures back to the East Coast, DC, and various other places to show what he was photographing. So he kind of manipulated that aspect.
Okay,
Very strange,
interesting.
but yeah, very, very different.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Anyone else? Any questions, comments about the curriculum?
I'm I'm curious about the technological advances, used in the period, that you covered.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned, like the what was that? The
daguerreotypes.
Yeah, and then before that, what was it? And so talk to me a little bit about the tech advances that made it possible.
So beginning with the daguerreotypes, that was the first permanent medium of photography, and it used silver nitrates on glass plates. Well, glass plates later, it was originally put on metal plates, placed into the camera cell. The shutter was set off. It would expose the person or whatever was being photographed into the camera. The image will be burned onto the plate, and then it will be developed through the wet darkroom process of taking it to the developer, the fixer. Then you would see the final image. The daguerreotypes are very lengthy, very chemical based. The calotype was very close to the film process we have today. It used paper, dipping and wetting the paper into a salt bath. Then the negative, which was already created previous to the developing process, is placed on the paper and it is exposed to sunlight. And the image through the glass negative will be projected onto the piece of paper, and it will be fixed again with another layer of chemical baths. Very close to what we have today. The albumin print used egg white as a way to sharpen the image. It made the chemicals bond to the paper much better. That was used particularly in the travels to Asia, Africa, South America, eggs were available, and they would take their regular chemical aspects along with them and use the albumin for that process. So in the 1830s all the way up into the 1910s, 1920s, there was a mixture of the daguerreotype process, that's the metal plate. They had the calotype process with the glass negative, which is similar to film, the albumin process with the egg, and the wet collodion process combined the darkroom aspects of the mixing and fixing of the chemicals with the glass negative. And they had to take their darkrooms, they had to take a tent, I won't say a darkroom, but a tent in order to cover themselves in order to properly develop their images while in the battlefield or while outside. Because when you're traveling behind the military, there is no studio available to sit down and there is no side room to go into. So they had to literally bring their wet room, their dark room chemicals out with them. It was very primitive. It was very primitive, very, very difficult. But the images that came out, these individuals were professional. They had been practicing since the advent of photography in the 1830s and 40s. And so these individuals had had a lot of practice by the time the Civil War came, maybe 20, 30 years of practice. Photography wasn't super, super new, but what photography was used to do was very different, as people learned how to use the original cameras. They took them to different places and they made pictures of the various things that they've never seen before. War, taking pictures of a battlefield, and what is that? You just see the paintings get produced later on, and people would go and see the gallery of paintings and go, oh, Sumter, Antietam. But when you see a picture of a group of soldiers just mowed down, that made people really think about the real harsh realities of war. It was very much different. The technology had been around for a little bit, so it wasn't super new to people, but what photography was being used to do and used to show shocked the masses. It was very jarring to people who had never been on a battlefield, never seen war, never experienced visually something like that. Yeah, so the technology moving with the war, moving with the battles, that was very much something new and different. Any more questions about technology, the concepts of the photography, battle photography, anything else from anybody? This was very different. This was very different, to say the least. All of our images in our American history books were from these individuals, sponsored and non-sponsored, that went around and followed these men and other persons through to the battles. So these images are often found in the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C., in private and other public spaces. They've been reproduced in newspapers again and again and again. At times, the original artifacts may not be available for view, but if you're persons in the government agencies or persons in the curatorial studies in museums, I think that you'd be able to see some of these original calotypes, these original daguerreotypes, original albumin prints. It's very fascinating. art as an artifact, as well as a way to show different things.
Can you put up your contact information on the screen again, who you are and your social media?
Yes.
Okay, all right, thank
I
you.
always keep that as the last slide. So ImaniHadden Photography, my Instagram, first name, last name, ImaniHadden. I have a link tree with other projects and things of that nature. My email is ImaniHadden Photography. I'm available for career building and mentorship for high schoolers in the Antelope Valley, so that's Lancaster and Palmdale regions. I'm also available for commissioned photo shoots. I'm the photographer for Peace in the Streets, and I am their arts aspect for these STEAM. So that's science, technology, engineering, arts, and mathematics.
Imani, I have
Yes.
another question.
Yes.
Okay, so I was thinking, so when you do week 9, because now we're moving or we're combining like art, photography, video together in AI and with NFTs and going in that area, as well as esports or e-gaming. Will you touch on that during that week as well? The combination, how that's working and moving along?
Yes, virtual reality is very much a part of photography, videoing movement. It's very different. It will be added into week 9 because it's just what's coming up now. I'm learning about it as I go on social media and people are talking about NFT, virtual reality, this and that. I'm going, we're on the cutting edge and we're living it right now. So yeah, that will be in week 9. Definitely a lot to cover in week 9 with the technological advances.
Can you put up your background so I can see? I missed the first part where I know you usually share your background information. What's your background? Do you have a slide that shows your
Yeah, it's at the beginning. So let me see if I can exit this. Okay, I can. My background, I'm at the beginning. Let's enter back into that.
Okay.
Okay, so yeah, I've received my Bachelor's of Fine Arts in Photography from Tulane University in 2018. I'm also a holder of an art history minor and a minor in architecture.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
And the image of myself was made by Jeff Whetstone. He is the director in Princeton University for their art program. Fantastic guy. When he was in New Orleans, Louisiana, he crossed paths with my professors, Annie Laurie Erickson and Jonathan Traviesa. He needed some models. So that was a picture of me on the Mississippi, sitting out there on a pylon. He said, look over there and close their eyes. And it ended up in the Julie Saw Gallery in New York. That was something different. Real special.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. Any questions? Any last moment questions before we end? Anybody? I don't want to leave anybody out. All right, everyone. Well, thank you very much for your time. This was week 3, Battlefield and the Parlor. Next week, we'll be going on to the Progressive era and the Jazz eras. Thank you very much. I will see you all next week.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Imani.
You're welcome, everybody. Appreciate your time.
Thank you, Imani.
You're welcome.
I think you did a great job.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
Yes.
I appreciate you. Thank you very much. And I learned a lot. I had photography in college. That's a long time ago. We won't talk about it. But I'm learning more. It's because a whole lot, I was in the dark room era, you know, so you know, a long time ago. So no, I really appreciate you and the knowledge that you all right. Thank you once again.
Thank you, everyone. All right.
Okay.